Hello, and welcome to The Game Changer, a series hosted by Kitman Labs, where we cover everything from sporting teams and sports science to cutting-edge technology.
So this is the first time that Russia is going to be hosting the World Cup, and they've created 11 new venues across the country, especially for this tournament. Russia's the largest country in terms of landmass in the world, so teams will be traveling vast distances. In fact, from their training camp in Grozny, Egypt, will be traveling 7,316 miles in just the 10 days in the group stage. It's not an even playing field because Colombia, on the other hand, will be traveling just over 1,000 miles in the first 10 days of the tournament. So a lot of press has been out there about the toll of travels on the players during the World Cup. And I'm lucky enough to be joined today by Pierre Barrieu, currently FIFA advisor and director of sports performance at LA Galaxy, who's an authority on coping with the demands placed upon athletes due to travel requirements in professional sport. So welcome, Pierre.
Hi, how are you? Nice to be here.
Very well, thank you. And Pierre, you literally wrote the book, or three books actually, where you explore this issue and you've dealt with it in firsthand during previous World Cups with the US men's national team and now also within the MLS with LA Galaxy. Firstly, focusing on the MLS and LA Galaxy, they're going to travel just under 50,000 miles, I think, this season. What are some of the potential side effects of this travel on players?
There are a few, but if you look at the main ones, I would say it would be disruption of sleeping patterns. Obviously, these are all effects of jet lag and not travel per se, dehydration and then excessive fatigue.
And how do you monitor your players during these high travel periods, monitor their sleep and look at the effects of jet lag and some of the other issues like hydration?
Well, when it comes to monitoring the sleep, I mean, you have many technologies out there, but I think that the main weapon is number one, education. As you mentioned, we're going 50,000 miles, so obviously we have time to practice, and our players are familiar with everything that needs to be done in order to minimize the jet lag and minimize the fatigue. When it comes to hydration, we have a hydration test on the match day -1, which most of the day is also a travel day. Sometimes we travel 2 days in advance when we play on the East Coast because it's a little more challenging to travel east than to travel west. But yeah, so I don't exactly monitor sleep when we on the road. This is something that we most likely do at home for people that have some sleeping issues. We make sure they're well hydrated. We make sure that that we adjust the time zone before we take off. So example, if it's a 5 p.m. in LA, well, I want the watches to be 8 p.m. assuming we went to New York, for example. And we also obviously adjust time meals as much as possible. The bigger challenge of the MLS at the end of the day is that you mentioned World Cups. Well, when you play in national team, when you travel, you're taking private plane, you're taking private jets, you're flying. Everybody's flying business. In the MLS, we're taking obviously regular flights, and it's a little more challenging when it comes to time spent at the airport and so forth. So,
and on a high level, what are the impacts of fatigue, hydration, and sleep on the player's performance? Why can this be such a big issue if you're not mitigating those issues?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the main risk is the injury risk goes dramatically up. If we're talking about a few criteria here, but if you can also combine 1, 2, or 3, or 4 of them. So if you have all of a sudden, the sleeping patterns that are being affected, so your CNS, the central nervous system, is going down, and then if on top of it, you're dehydrated, and obviously you're going to be fatigued, then your risk of being hurt goes through the roof, and as well as your risk of not playing well. So these are the reasons why you want to make sure you put all the chances on your side, and then you deal with this as much as you can. You deal with everything that you can prepare in advance.
You mentioned there a few of the ways in which you do plan to mitigate some of the side effects of travel. Can you give any more examples? You said about traveling a couple of days in advance before you travel east, if you can. Are there other strategies which you put in place in the MLS?
Well, again, I mean, when you talk MLS, so the worst case scenario is a 6-hour flight with a 3-hour time difference. Okay, and the worst case scenario would be to travel east, which unfortunately for us is it's always the case because we live on the west coast. So for this particular example, then we try to adjust. We try to find a flight. Again, we're not flying charter. We're only allowed 4 charter, not even flight segments per season, not including playoffs. So we try to find a flight that, if possible, arrive early, okay? Because it's always easier to adapt to a longer day than to a shorter day. Very rarely possible when you fly from the west coast to the east coast. Why? And also why? Because we want to make sure that the meal can be done at regular times. What else do? We wearing. I mean, one thing I haven't mentioned so far is the compression tights. We want to make sure that our guys are wearing tights, to improve the blood circulation. You don't want to end up with any kind of deep vein thrombosis or even one like a PE in a plane, pulmonary embolism. So they wear tights. Not so much in the US, but internationally for sure. The sunlight, access to sunlight or exposure to sunlight, I should say, it's key when it comes to fighting jet lag. Not so much when it's only three time zones. So basically, it's hydration is wearing the tights and make as much as we can finding flights that can accommodate like a regular schedule for us. Again, easier said than done, especially when you're flying to the East Coast.
And you mentioned there about, traveling through just 3 hours time zone. Some of the teams going to the World Cup will be traveling through, multiple time zones. And what kind of recommendations prior to the tournament would you give to those teams? And obviously from your time with the US national team in 3 World Cups, what strategies did you use leading into them?
Well, the challenge when it comes to traveling and jet lag and like how it can affect performance with the World Cup starts way before the World Cup. The biggest travel is let's say in the US, which unfortunately is not the case this year for Russia, or any country for South America or the American continent or Central. The challenge is actually the trip to, let's say, Russia, because that's the one that is really going to be tough to recover from. So basically what you do, it's all in the timing. It's all in the timing of the things. When do you want to fly? There's a rule of thumb that said that whenever you're flying east, then you will probably need almost 2 days per hour of time difference to recover, as opposed to 1 when you're flying west. So you want to make sure that you get there kind of as early as possible to minimize the risk. You mentioned about the base camps from Egypt, as opposed to Colombia. That's also, that work is being done maybe 2 years in advance, okay? And sometimes you have to gamble because you don't know exactly what your group is going to be like. You don't know exactly where you're going to play. But I'm going to give you one example from the US in 2010, where we knew that we had the chances, looking at the sites, and that's a different topic here. We're going to talk briefly about altitude. We knew that the chances looking at our site to play at altitude were almost 60%. So we actually decided to pick a base camp that was kind of centrally located, to minimize the travel, and also at altitude, to be exposed to this on a regular basis. So these are decisions you make way before. So the challenge for jet lag and travel comes, from the initial flight to Russia, and you want to have sufficient time on site to recover. And for the rest, I'm going back to the exposure to sunlight. So you want to be in a plane. It's easy to do because guess what? It's a private plane. So the blinds stay up. Because it may be 8 a.m. at destination. Meanwhile, for you, it's only 11 p.m., but that's fine. The blinds stay up and then you'll be sleeping when you get there. You really have to be adapted and put yourself in a situation where, you're already at destination time, which is not easy. Believe me, it's not easy to pull up to keep the blinds up, when the guys feel like sleeping because this is the night. But you just have to do it. And the airlines actually, even when you travel, the airlines pull the blind down, not because it's good for you, it's because it's kind of easier for them, because for people to sleep. But at the same time, sometimes it's not justified. It's the blind should stay up because it's your time. We're not going to go into the hormonal studies about the vitamin D, the melatonin, and all that stuff, but that's a big one. And another thing also that I haven't mentioned so far is the exposure to noise. I obviously recommend the noise cancelling headphones because this has been proven to really disrupt your brain waves. And if you can, as much as possible, don't disrupt your exposure to sunlight by the blinds. Don't be exposed to excessive noise over a prolonged period of time, like it's the case, in a plane. Then you put all your chances, then you maximize your chances to get over quickly over potential jet lag.
And you mentioned very briefly there about altitude, and obviously, the body can adapt to performing at altitude. Do you think that there's a similar way of coping, so the players who are playing in leagues with high travel requirement would actually be an advantage going to Russia compared to some who, like in the UK, the longest journey might be a couple of hours or an hour and a half on an aeroplane?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. The only advantage I could see is the familiarity aspect of things. But at the end of the day, it's better to have been less disrupted during the season than the opposite. That's at least that's my take on things. So looking at Russia, I would say at the end of the day, it's still better, to discover that travel problem, rather than to have been exposed to it the whole season and then having to dealt with it the whole season. So it's a yes and no question. If I had to pick, I probably would think, hey, we haven't done it many often, but this is all the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things we need to do, rather than say, hey guys, you guys are used to it, you know what to do, and it's just one more travel.
That makes sense. And then when they arrive in Russia, what can be done in order to kind of settle the athletes in, I suppose, outside of the getting them into the routine, eating at the right time, training at the right time, being exposed to sunlight and so on?
Well, early on, to have them settle, we've been over the criteria already, and there are no other ones, The one thing the coach control is maybe altering training times early on, okay? Because you have to be flexible on the first day. That's one more reason why you need to arrive early, to have time on site, to be able to make all these adjustments. So you can alter training times, you can monitor hydration a little more, but there's really nothing else you can do. The problem that you have when you get there is that you have to train. I'm going to give you another concrete example that. Going back to my last World Cup in 2010, when we knew that they'd be exposed to altitude, then we also say, hey, so we're going to be exposed to altitude, and apparently, well, not apparently, this is the way it is. You have to be able to be on site to leave what we call leave high, train low. So, but we have to be there to be comfortable with the altitude level, but at the same time, we have to train, and we have to play. So we made the decision to have the bulk of our training in the US, and then to report to South Africa really early. I think we're the second earliest team to get there. Most of the other countries, and in Europe as well, they decided to go train at altitude level, which in my mind is detrimental. So to answer before going to South Africa. So to answer your question, there's not much you can do other than planning enough time on site just to adapt and to be perfectly settled, and that the jet lag is not going to be a factor by the time you play game one. And that's another reason why the European teams are at an advantage for a World Cup in Europe.
So just to summarize then, from all of the pieces that we've discussed, if you were to recommend the top 3 things which a team or an individual player can do in order to mitigate this travel within the tournament and travel to the tournament, what would they be?
Well, number 1 is be on destination time. Okay, that's you get to the airport, whatever is time at the destination, that's your time. Number 2 would be to be strong enough to stay on destination time during the travel. I've had speeches in Europe where I knew I would be landing at 6 a.m. and therefore I would be sleeping in the plane because I would have to be awake at 6 a.m. Rather than doing the opposite. Number 2 would be probably staying strong in the plane, and number 3, all the other things we mentioned, like staying hydrated. That's a no-brainer. Cabin pressure is going to dehydrate you a lot up there. And then that's about it. That's what I can think of.
Outstanding advice. I really appreciate you taking the time out, Pierre. Thank you very much.
I appreciate it. Thank you.